Welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're going to unpack how a brand new set of university rules in India, rules designed to protect students, actually ended up dividing them. We're talking about a well-intentioned policy that sparked nationwide protests and even landed in the Supreme Court.
Okay, so picture this. It's January 13th, 2026. India's University Grants Commission, the UGC, rolls out these new regulations to stamp out discrimination on college campuses. But instead of applause, they get protests and legal challenges. So, why? To really get to the bottom of it, we have to look past the policy itself and start with the human tragedies that set this whole thing in motion.
Right. So these regulations didn't just appear out of thin air. They were really forged in the fire of a crisis on campus, born from some incredibly painful events that just demanded a response.
Just let that sink in. This heartbreaking line is from the suicide note of a university student named Rohit Bamula. His death back in 2016, and then the death of Dr. Payal Tadvi in 2019, both of which were linked to alleged caste-based discrimination, sent these massive shockwaves across India. It forced the whole issue of campus bias right into the national spotlight.
So after these tragedies, the students' mothers took their case to the Supreme Court. And in 2025, the court came back with a really clear order. The government had to create a very strong and robust mechanism to deal with discrimination. And that, right there, set the stage for the UGC's new regulations. It's a direct line from personal loss to a national mandate for change.
So, what exactly did the UGC cook up in its court-mandated solution? Let's break down the key parts of these new and much stricter rules.
On the surface, the goal was pretty straightforward: make all higher education institutions safer and more inclusive. The rules were supposed to protect all students, but they had a special focus on those from historically disadvantaged communities, what are known in India as scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward classes, or SC, ST, and OBC for short.
The plan was to build this whole new multi-layered support system on every single campus. You'd have equal opportunity centers for things like policy and counseling, you'd have equity committees to actually investigate complaints, and you'd even have these mobile equity squads to keep an eye on places like canteens and dorms.
And to make sure complaints were actually taken seriously, the rules put this new super fast timeline in place. Get this, an equity committee had to meet within 24 hours of a complaint. They had 15 days to finish their investigation, and then the head of the school had just 7 days to take action. The clock was ticking.
And to give these rules some real teeth, the regulations came with some pretty severe punishments for any school that didn't comply. We're talking everything from losing all your UGC funding to literally having your recognition as an institution completely revoked.
But here's the twist. These rules, born from tragedy and designed for protection, didn't unite the country at all. They split it right down the middle. An immediate and really widespread backlash turned this whole policy into a national controversy, fast.
Okay, so to really get the backlash, you got to see how different these 2026 regulations were from the old rules from 2012. There were 4 huge changes. First, they expanded protections to include OBC students. Second, they got rid of the penalty for filing a false complaint. Third, they brought in much stricter punishments for the universities. And fourth, they created those mandatory equity squads. And as you're about to see, every single one of those changes became a massive point of debate.
So the folks protesting had 4 main arguments. First, they said that defining caste-based discrimination as something that only happens to SC, ST, and OBC students was unfair and excluded everyone else. Second, they worried that with no penalty for false complaints, the system could be misused for personal vendettas. Third, they pointed out that there was no requirement for general category students to be represented on these new committees. And finally, they argued that some of the language, like the term indirect discrimination, was just too vague and could be twisted.
But supporters saw things very differently. They argued that because of India's specific history with caste, you need a targeted framework. They said that having penalties for false complaints just scares real victims into staying silent. And they insisted that having people from these communities on the investigation panels was the only way you could build enough trust for people to feel safe coming forward at all.
And this is where it got really tricky, legally speaking. The whole fight pretty much boiled down to 2 different definitions of discrimination that were right there in the same document. One was really broad and universal. It protected any student from bias. But the other one specifically defined caste-based discrimination as something that only applies to SC, ST, and OBC students. So critics jumped on this, asking, hey, if we already have a rule that protects everybody, why do we need this second, more restrictive one?
So with protests breaking out and the whole country just deeply divided, the issue landed right back where it all began, inside the Supreme Court.
And on January 29th, the court made a huge move. It ordered that the new regulations be put in abeyance, which is basically a legal way of saying they hit the pause button on the whole thing, for the entire country.
And just listen to the court's reasoning, because it's pretty stark. They warned that if they didn't step in, it could lead to a dangerous impact and would divide the society. I mean, that just shows you how serious the social fallout had become.
So the court's decision really came down to a few major problems it saw. It said the language was vague and capable of misuse. It pointed out that conflict between the two definitions of discrimination, and in the end, it called for the entire set of rules to be reviewed by a committee of experts before anything else could happen.
So, where does all this leave us? Well, for now, India's universities have gone back to using the older 2012 regulations. The new rules are on ice, and pretty much everyone is just waiting for the Supreme Court's next hearing on March 19th to see what happens next.
And this whole saga leaves us with a really fundamental and frankly very difficult question. It shows this incredibly delicate balancing act between creating targeted protections for the most vulnerable groups and, at the same time, upholding universal principles of equality for everyone. And how a society figures that out, well, that's a debate that is far, far from over.